Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 796, and today is May 9th, 2025. I'm the host of this show, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to get into on today's show, so I'm going to jump right into it. Just want to remind people to check out the Kyle Anzalone Show. We are live every Monday and Wednesday at 4:45 Eastern Time. Last week, I had Misty Winston on the show, old friend of this program, so go check out that interview. And coming up next week, I have Kelly Vlahos and Daniel McAdams returning to the show. Two interviews you definitely will not want to miss. So subscribe to the Kyle Anzalone Show. That way you get notifications and you can check out those episodes. It's the first link in the show notes page wherever you're listening to me right now. Let's jump into it. First up here, Russia-Ukraine trade accusations of ceasefire violations. I wrote this one for the Institute on May 8th. Moscow and Kiev have accused each other of hundreds of violations of a unilateral Russian ceasefire within hours of it taking effect. The Kremlin said the ceasefire came into effect at midnight Moscow time on Thursday. After Russia announced a 3-day pause in the fighting, Ukrainian President Zelensky said his military would not observe the truce. The Russian Defense Ministry reported nearly 500 Ukrainian attacks on Russian forces in the first half day of the ceasefire. The Russian statement said, the deliberate destructive actions of the Ukrainian side against Russia confirms the desire of the Kiev regime to prevent peaceful settlement of the Ukraine conflict. The Russian military strictly observed the ceasefire. In particular, no strikes are being carried out by aircraft, missiles, forces, artillery, and drones. Now, I think it's a little bit absurd that Russia is trying to make this out to be, oh, this proves Ukraine doesn't want peace because they're not following our unilateral ceasefire. If Ukraine declared a unilateral 30-day ceasefire and said, oh, this proves that Russia doesn't want peace if Russia didn't comply, well, no, that's not really the case. It seems what the Russian side did here is they carried out some pretty major offensive operations on May 8th and took some new towns and villages in eastern Ukraine. And so over this 3-day ceasefire period, they're likely going to be, reestablishing and fortifying their new positions and things like that, and maybe not carrying out so many offensive operations. And so to some extent, this is kind of works out strategically from Russia, who again was the side that unilaterally declared this ceasefire. If Ukraine were to declare 30, 60, 90-day ceasefire, whatever it may be, and use that time to fortify its positions, to train new soldiers, to get them to the front lines, to rearm, get new weapon shipments from its Western backers, then of course that would be strategic for Ukraine, and for Kiev to say, oh, if Moscow doesn't abide by this proves Moscow doesn't want peace. It's a fairly hollow argument. Now, Kiev is claiming that Russia conducted over 700 attacks after the pause in the fighting, and Kiev pointed to the Russian military operations in eastern Ukraine. However, according to South Front, which I think does a pretty good and fair job of tracking the Russian battlefield, they report that the Russian military forces did wrap up their attacks before the midnight ceasefire. Now, my guess is the Russian forces are carrying out some retaliatory and defensive attacks on the Ukrainian side, assuming that the Ukrainians are just treating this like any old day of the war, because from their perspective, and again, this made sense, this isn't a ceasefire, and so they're going to continue to attack and do the same things that the Ukrainian forces would have done if it was any other Friday, right? So I think that's the Ukrainian position, and of course the Russians aren't just going to sit there and allow themselves to be attacked and their soldiers to be killed. So the Kremlin declared the ceasefire in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. Russia is hosting a major celebration on Friday, with many world leaders traveling to Moscow to attend a major military parade that happened just this morning. I saw some pictures of it before I hopped on to record. I think the Chinese leader, Xi, was the main world leader in attendance. He had the most position of prominence next to Putin. Of course, it was particularly notable that Robert Fico, the Slovak prime minister, did attend. Many European countries closed their airspace to his plane, forcing him to take a rather elaborate route around Europe in order to get into Russian airspace, essentially having to fly over the Mediterranean Sea into the Atlantic and then the Arctic in order to get to Russia. So Zelensky warned world leaders against attending the event, saying that Ukraine couldn't ensure their safety, but it doesn't seem like there were any major attacks on the military parade, and so no cause for concern there. Now, Russia declared a similar ceasefire to mark Easter. That unilateral pause also led to both sides accusing the other of violations of that ceasefire hundreds of times, and so this isn't a successful way to bring about the end of the war or achieve any kind of pause in actual fighting. And again, this seems like some grandstanding in Russia and the Kremlin and Putin kind of standing on a soapbox trying to claim that, this proves that Ukraine doesn't want peace. Now, I don't think that Ukraine actually does want to bring an end to this conflict, at least not the Ukrainian leadership, but that has nothing to do with what's going on here. This is all about, strategic in the battlefield. Now, getting into the Ukrainian ceasefire proposal, Trump speaks with Zelensky and calls for an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. So President Trump on Thursday called for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire in Ukraine and threatened sanctions if it is not respected. And again, this is, kind of like what I was saying in the other article, just pointless, right? One side declaring a ceasefire that benefits their battlefield position is not something that's going to end up happening here, and it's just going to lead to each side pointing the finger at the other, and maybe even escalating this war more so than doing anything to tamp down on hostilities. All right, next up here, the Israelis are admitting what for listeners of my show and readers of antiwar.com have surely known since October 8th, 2023, and that is the Israeli military lists returning the hostages as their least important goal for Gaza. So the Israeli military has listed the return of remaining Israeli captives in Gaza as its least important goal in its plans for the escalated assault on the Strip, Haaretz reported on Wednesday. According to the report, retrieving hostages was placed last in the list of 6 objectives. Those goals include 1. Defeating Hamas, 2. Operational control over the territory, 3. Demilitarizing the territory, 4. Striking Hamas government targets, 5. Concentrating and moving the population, and 6. Returning the captives. And so you see right there, 5. Moving the population, genocide, ethnic cleansing of Gaza is more important than 6. Returning the hostages. This has obviously been Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's goal since the beginning, and while he isn't the one that publicly states it, many members of his government have, including the National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich, and the Defense Minister, who's I guess been the Defense Minister just this year, but Israel Katz has also said this multiple times, that the goal is ethnic cleansing, that the goal is taking the territory, flattening it, removing the Palestinians, and then the Israelis have talked about settling the land and replacing the Palestinian population with a Jewish population. So news of the Israeli military goals come after Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admitted that retrieving the hostages was not his top priority, something that's been clear for a long time but hasn't been explicitly stated by the Israeli leader until last week. The Israeli military finalized plans for the expanded operation dubbed Gideon's Chariot on Tuesday and Wednesday after the government approved the escalation. The purpose of the expanded assault is to achieve the full military occupation of Gaza and concentrate the entire civilian population into a tiny area of southern Gaza with the goal of forcing them to leave to achieve ethnic cleansing. And I think one of the things that we should also point out here too is that if the Palestinians are unwilling to leave, the Israeli goal seems to be to kill them all. Right, to let them either starve to death or be on the receiving end of Israeli bombs and bullets. That if they will not leave, they will die. There will be no Palestinians in Gaza. That is the policy. So the inclusion of concentrating and moving the population as a fifth goal in the Israelis' military makes it clear that ethnic cleansing is being prioritized over freeing the hostages. So Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich said Tuesday, the Gazan citizens will be concentrated in the south. They will be totally disappearing, understanding that there is no hope and nothing to look for in Gaza, and it will be looking for relocation to begin new life in other places. And of course, this is something that he has said time and time again, and the Israeli military has established an office dedicated to resettling Palestinians outside of Gaza. Now, one more thing to mention here is there's this news story that's going around. It originated in an Israeli media outlet that said the relationship between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu has completely broken down. I am very skeptical of this reporting. I see a lot of celebration among what I think are the best elements of Trump's base and the MAGA right. This story. I'm very skeptical that this is the case. I think over the weekend and maybe into next week, we will find out more details as Trump makes his first trip to the Middle East. But I am expecting Trump to remain full support of Israel. Even if he maybe does get a little upset with Netanyahu, I don't think that in any way meaningfully changes the relationship between Washington and Tel Aviv. Certainly, these will be questions I will ask my guests on the Kyle Anzalone show next week, Kelly Vallejos and Dan McAdams. So, one of the big stories coming out of Gaza is that all the aid kitchens are shutting down, and the World Central Kitchen halts aid operations in Gaza due to the Israeli blockade. So WCK, a U.S.-based charity, said on Wednesday it was forced to shut down aid operations in Gaza due to the total Israeli blockade on the Palestinian territory. So the statement said, after serving more than 130 million total meals and 26,000 loaves of bread over the past 18 months, WCK no longer has supplies to cook meals or make bread in Gaza. Since Israel closed the border crossings in early March, WCK has been unable to replenish the stocks of food that we use to feed hundreds of thousands of Gazans daily. The charity said in recent weeks that its teams in Gaza stretched remaining ingredients and fuel sources using creativity and determination, but it has now reached the limits of what is possible. WCK's field kitchens in Gaza have run out of ingredients, and its mobile bakery has run out of flour, the charity said, and that its trucks loaded with food and cooking oil are ready to enter Gaza, but they are being blocked by Israel. So the celebrity chef that founded WCK, Jose Andres, said, our trucks loaded with food supplies are waiting in Egypt, Jordan, and Israel, ready to enter Gaza, but they cannot move without permission. Humanitarian aid must be allowed to flow. And so again, this is a American celebrity chef. This isn't somebody that anybody accuses of being tied to Hamas or any such thing. Does anybody think that if these aid trucks of his charity are allowed to enter Gaza, that he's going to give them to Hamas? Of course he would face charges in the United States for that. But that's not the issue here. The issue for the Israelis is very clear. Blocking the aid at this point isn't about, as they said many times during the Joe Biden administration, making sure supplies didn't get to Hamas. This is about deliberately inflicting pain on the civilian population of Gaza, intentionally starving children to death in order to break the will of the Palestinian people and get them to give up and leave. It's very clear that that's the Israeli policy. So, UN aid agencies also say they have thousands of trucks ready to bring food into Gaza, but Israel is maintaining its blockade. So next up, let's move on and talk about Trump's coming trip to Saudi Arabia. Report, Trump delinked Saudi nuclear deal from Israeli normalization. So the new U.S. is no longer demanding that Saudi Arabia normalize relations with Israel to move forward with talks on establishing a Saudi nuclear program, Reuters reported on Thursday. The Biden administration had been working on a potential Israeli-Saudi normalization deal that would have involved the U.S. helping the Saudis establish a nuclear program and signing a mutual defense treaty with Riyadh. There were reports in September of 2023 that said Riyadh was willing to drop its long-standing condition that Palestinian state must be established before it would normalize relations with Israel, but those talks fell apart after Hamas's October 7th attack and Israel unleashing its genocidal war on Gaza. Over the past year and a half, Saudi officials have made clear there will be no Israel normalization without a Palestinian state. The idea of a U.S.-Saudi mutual defense treaty has also been dropped, and President Trump is willing to move forward on the nuclear talks without Israeli involvement. Now, one of the reasons I think this is really a really important story is that this was something that was being kicked around during the first Trump administration. The idea that we were going to have a new agreement with Saudi Arabia that led to the U.S. giving Saudi Arabia nuclear technology. Now, one of the Saudis' main requirements, one of the things that they were really pushing for, is to have the technology to enrich their own uranium. And so this would give them a nuclear program with the same abilities as the Iranian program. Now, over time, they may have to upgrade their centrifuges and make advancements as they go along, but they want the same fundamental capabilities as the Iranians have. And of course, that would mean that the Saudis would then have the components to make a nuclear weapon. Not that they would have a nuclear weapons program. They would have a civilian nuclear energy program, but it would be one with all the technology needed to build at least to, make the raw materials for a nuclear bomb. I guess, there's questions about the delivery system and actually making the nuclear weapon as well. But I think this is significant. Now, when past U.S. negotiations have happened with countries to give them technology for a nuclear program, it's been in the line of the nuclear program that we gave the UAE, which is called a 1-2-3 agreement, where we give them the ability to help them build nuclear power plants, but then the enrichment is done in third countries. I think mainly the U.S. and France, but they give their spent nuclear waste to other countries to then enrich the uranium into, or make fuel rods with it and things like that. So I imagine that the Trump administration would be more likely, say, than the Biden administration to give Saudi Arabia a nuclear program that's outside of the 1-2-3 agreement, and I think that's a major concern. Now, we also have the talks going on with the Iranians, and I would be interested to see how the U.S. giving Saudi Arabia a nuclear program would impact Tehran's position on its nuclear energy program. But I don't think that's going to really come into play yet. So Vice President J.D. Vance says U.S.-Iran talks are on the right pathway, but repeated false claims about uranium enrichment. So Vice President Vance said on Wednesday that negotiations between the U.S. and Iran are on the right pathway, although he repeated a false claim that no other country in the world besides Iran has a nuclear enrichment program without a nuclear weapons program, a talking point first used by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Several non-nuclear armed states that are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty enrich uranium at low levels, including Japan, Germany, and Brazil. So the vice president said at the Munich conference in Washington, "Let me ask this basic question. Which regime in the world has a civilian nuclear and enrichment program without having a nuclear weapon? The answer is no one." And of course, as I just said, I'm pretty sure the Saudis may be the next country to have that technology given to them by the United States. So Vance said that Iran could maintain a civilian nuclear program, but his comments about enrichment suggest that all uranium enrichment must be eliminated, a condition Tehran has strongly rejected. "We don't care if people want a nuclear power. We're fine with that, but you can't have this kind of enrichment program that allows you to get a nuclear weapon. That's where we draw the line," Vance added. So the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, limited Iran's uranium enrichment at 3.67%, far below the 90% needed for weapons grade, and made its nuclear program subject to the most stringent inspections in the world. Vance criticized that deal, claiming it let open a path for an Iranian nuclear weapon. So Vance said, "We believe that there were some elements of their nuclear program that were preserved under the JCPOA. Yes, they weren't nuclear weapons. Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon, but Iran to stay on the sort of guide path towards nuclear weapon if they flip a switch and press go." And so there, is some truth to that Iran, Japan, Brazil, Germany all possess a latent nuclear deterrent, the ability to make a nuclear bomb if they so chose to. But, inspections on the Iranian program ensure, and everything that comes out of the Iranian government says, Tehran is not trying to build a nuclear weapon. And so if the U.S. says that Iran has to give up all enrichment, it's likely going to kill any potential for a deal. All right, so next up here, Senators Cotton and Graham work to sabotage chances of Iran deal. Senators Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham, a Republican from Arkansas and South Carolina, and two of the most hawkish members of the Congress, are working together to sabotage the Trump administration's chances of reaching a deal with Iran. On Thursday, the senators held a press conference outlining a resolution they're introducing that demands that any deal with Iran include the total disarmament of Tehran's nuclear enrichment program, an idea that Iranian officials have made clear as a non-starter. And so I think this is one of the main problems that Trump would have, even if he was really serious about pursuing and making a deal with the Iranians, getting back into something that resembles the Iran nuclear deal, is I do think on some level that would require the assent of Congress when it comes to removing some of these sanctions on Iran. And I don't think Trump is going to have the votes. I think a lot of the Republican senators are going to vote against them on this, and then several Democrats as well. You look at Chuck Schumer, particularly John Fetterman. I mean, there are a lot of pro-Israeli senators who would not allow this deal to go through, and so they're just going to add conditions and poison pills until a deal is impossible. Now, wrapping up here with news on Yemen. So Yemen's Houthis launched drone attack on Israel after reaching a ceasefire with the U.S. And so really big story out of Yemen, was that the U.S. and Ansar Allah, the Houthis, had come to an agreement that was basically an American capitulation. So what the Houthis have said and done from the beginning is that they don't want to have conflict with the West. They don't want to have conflict with the U.S. They are in a conflict that they have declared against Israel because they believe they need to stand up to what Israel is doing in Gaza. So whether that's right or wrong, whether the Yemeni people want to go to war with Israel, that's what Ansar Allah did. Now, the U.S. didn't have to get involved in this, but under Biden in January of 2024, we chose to. And over the ensuing year, up until January 19th of 2025, the U.S., along with the U.K., was bombing Yemen, trying to take out Houthi targets and killing a lot of civilians in the process, of course. Now, I guess it's important to remember that the Houthis, Ansar Allah, never intended to bring the Americans into this. They were stopping Israeli-linked shipping from going through the Red Sea, passing by their coast. It was only after the U.S. started attacking Yemen that they expanded that blockade on shipping to include American-linked shipping, and then they also started attacking the American warships that were attacking Yemen. And so when the ceasefire went into effect on January 19th earlier this year, Ansar Allah said, okay, our issue with Israel has been resolved. We'll end all attacks. And that's what happened until Israel broke that ceasefire and imposed a full blockade on Gaza on March 2nd. So I believe it was March 15th that the Houthis announced that they would reimpose the blockade, again, just on Israeli shipping. And Trump responded to that by bombing Yemen, leading the Houthis to start again attacking American ships. And so we see how this works. The Houthis want to be in conflict with Israel. That is very clear, at least as long as Tel Aviv is waging a genocide in Gaza. If that ends, the Houthis, I don't think, won't keep attacking Israel. And they made that clear during the ceasefire period. So when the U.S. says, okay, we're going to involve ourselves in this and start attacking Yemen, then the Houthis, the government of Yemen, do what any other country would do. They start attacking the United States. Now, over the past 6 weeks, the U.S. has pummeled Yemen with at least 1,000 airstrikes. I think I saw yesterday one, the Houthi leaders say that it was actually 1,700 airstrikes the U.S. has launched on Yemen during that time. This cost billions of dollars, 2 aircraft carrier strike groups in the region. And while the U.S. hasn't seemingly done any damage to Yemen, to the Houthis, we lost 2 fighter jets. We've killed civilians in Yemen. We destroyed infrastructure. We bombed cities and civilian targets, certainly. But as far as the damage, that the Houthis remain in control of Yemen, and they continue to be able to carry out attacks on Israel and U.S. aircraft carriers. And so Trump said that initially that the Houthis have capitulated. But when the U.S. stops attacking Yemen and the Houthis stop attacking the U.S., that's not a Houthi capitulation. That's a Washington capitulation. This is what the Houthis want. And they're still firing on Israel. And so my guess is that Trump is going to let Israel, or maybe not let, but certainly fund and provide the weapons for Israel bombing Yemen if they want to do so, but the U.S. is just kind of removing itself from that conflict. There's also the report that a second U.S. F-18 was lost in these operations in the Red Sea. So just a massive embarrassment for Trump and the United States here. All right, everybody, that's where I'm going to wrap up the show for the week. Thank you all so much for tuning in. I am just a little tired today, so I felt like this show might have been a little off, but hopefully I'll get some good rest over the weekend. My baby's teeth are coming in, which is fantastic. She's getting older, so proud of her, but she is also not sleeping as well as she usually does, which means I'm not sleeping as well as I usually do. But again, hopefully I'll get some rest over the weekend, and Monday we'll be back with another episode of Conflicts of Interest, and then Kelly Vallejos on the Kyle Anzalone Show at 4:45. Thanks, everyone. We'll be back with another show again soon.